You ever think about getting away from it all, Mateo? Dominic asked, his voice low and smooth, like he was letting me in on a secret I wasn't supposed to know. It was a simple question, but it felt heavy. I looked up from my phone, trying to figure out what he meant. Dominic was my dad's best friend, sharp-dressed, confident, and the kind of guy people listened to without him ever needing to raise his voice. His cologne lingered in the air between us, warm and woody, like a hug that stuck to your skin. "I guess," I said, shrugging. I didn't know where he was going with this, but Dominic didn't do small talk. He was always purposeful. "I've got a cabin upstate, quiet, private, away from all the noise." He paused, leaning back in his chair with an easy smirk. "Your dad thinks it might be good for you to join me this weekend. Clear your head." Clear my head? The way he said it made me feel like he knew something I didn't. Or maybe he just saw more than I let on. I'd been stuck in a rut lately, trying to figure out who I was and where I fit in the world. My dad didn't notice stuff like that. But Dominic? He saw me. "I don't know," I said, hesitant. A trip with Dominic sounded intense. Not bad, necessarily. But I wasn't sure I could handle being alone with him for that long. "Think about it," he said, standing up and clapping me on the shoulder. His touch lingered just a second longer than I expected, firm but not rough. "I'll pick you up Friday morning if you're in. Don't overthink it, Mateo. Sometimes you just need to say yes." Friday came faster than I expected. Dominic's black SUV was already idling in the driveway when I stepped outside with my bag. He leaned against the hood, sunglasses reflecting the morning sun, looking like he'd just stepped out of a magazine. "Right on time," he said, opening the passenger door for me. The drive was long, but Dominic knew how to fill the silence without talking too much. He asked me about school, my friends, and what I wanted to do with my life. I didn't have solid answers, but he didn't seem to mind. "You're young," he said. "You don't have to have it all figured out yet." That was easy for him to say. Dominic was in his 40s, had a successful career, and seemed like he knew exactly who he was. I found myself wondering what it must feel like to be so sure of yourself. As the miles rolled by, the city faded into open fields and dense forests. Dominic's playlist, classic rock and old blues, filled the car, the low hum of the music matching the rhythm of the road. By the time we reached the cabin, the sun was dipping low in the sky, casting everything in a golden glow. The place was exactly what Dominic had described, secluded and quiet, surrounded by towering pines. It felt like stepping into another world, one where the rules didn't apply. "This is nice," I said, stepping out of the car. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine and earth. "Wait until you see the inside," Dominic said, grabbing my bag and leading the way. The cabin was rustic but modern. Plush leather couches, a stone fireplace, and large windows that framed the forest like a painting. It felt intimate, almost too intimate. Dominic handed me a glass of water as I took it all in. "I told you it'd be worth it." For a moment, I couldn't tell if he was talking about the cabin or something else entirely. There was something about the way he looked at me, like he was waiting for me to understand something I hadn't quite caught on to yet. Later, as the night settled in and we sat on the porch watching the stars, Dominic spoke again. "You ever just stop and let yourself feel everything?" he asked, his voice softer now. I hesitated, unsure how to answer. "Not really. It's easier to just keep moving, you know?" He nodded, like he understood exactly what I meant. Maybe this weekend will change that. The way he said it sent a shiver down my spine, though the air wasn't cold. I didn't know what he meant, but I wanted to find out. "You've got a steady hand," Dominic said, his voice low and approving. "That's rare." I tightened my grip on the wrench as I worked to loosen the stubborn bolt on the generator. The cabin had lost power earlier that morning, and Dominic decided it was the perfect opportunity to teach me something. I wasn't sure what was more nerve-wracking, the task at hand or the way he stood close enough for me to feel his breath against my neck. Maybe, I said, glancing up at him, or maybe I'm just pretending to know what I'm doing. He chuckled, a deep, rich sound that made my chest tighten. Pretending's half the battle, Mateo. Confidence makes people believe you've got it under control, even when you don't. There was again the way he said my name like it carried extra weight. His gaze lingered on me just long enough to make me wonder if he meant more than what he was saying. I turned back to the generator, feeling the heat rise to my face. By the afternoon, the power was back on, and Dominic suggested a walk through the woods to clear our heads. The path was narrow, lined with towering pines that blocked out most of the sky. It felt like we were the only two people in the world. "You remind me of myself at your age," he said, breaking the silence. "Really?" I asked, skeptical. Dominic was so put together, so sure of himself. I couldn't imagine him ever being unsure of anything. "Yeah," he said, shoving his hands into his jacket pockets. "Lost, trying to figure out where I fit, who I was." The vulnerability in his voice surprised me. It was the first crack I'd seen in his confident exterior, and it made him feel more real. "How'd you figure it out?" I asked. He stopped walking, turning to face me. The sunlight filtering through the trees caught the edges of his face, softening his usually sharp features. "I stopped running from it," he said simply. "Sometimes you have to let yourself feel things, even if they scare you." The weight of his words hung between us, and for a moment, I wasn't sure if he was talking about himself or me. That evening, we sat by the fireplace, the room filled with the warm crackle of burning wood. Dominic poured 2 glasses of whiskey, sliding one across the coffee table toward me. "I won't tell if you won't," he said with a wink. I hesitated, but something about the way he looked at me, like we were in on a secret together, made me reach for the glass. The first sip burned, but I didn't care. "You're not like most people your age," he said, leaning back in his chair. "You've got this depth to you." I laughed, unsure how to respond. "Depth? I'm just trying to figure out what the hell I'm doing, same as everyone else." He shook his head, smiling. "No, it's more than that. You see things differently. It's refreshing." The room felt smaller, the air heavier. I didn't know what to say, so I just looked at him, trying to decipher the expression on his face. Was it admiration? Curiosity? Something else entirely? When the power flickered again later that night, Dominic grabbed a flashlight and motioned for me to follow him outside. The generator was fine, but he wanted to check the breaker box just to be safe. The night was cool and quiet, the only sound the crunch of our footsteps on the gravel path. Dominic knelt by the breaker box, his broad shoulders illuminated by the flashlight in my hand. "Hold it steady," he said, glancing back at me. I tried to focus, but the way his hand brushed mine as he reached for a switch sent a jolt through me. It was barely a touch, but it lingered, charged with something unspoken. He paused, looking at me. His face was shadowed, but his eyes held mine, searching. I felt frozen, caught between wanting to step closer and needing to step away. "Mateo," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. The way he said my name this time was different, less playful, more intentional. The flashlight trembled slightly in my hand as the tension between us grew thick enough to cut. "I think we've got it," he said finally, flipping the last switch. The lights in the cabin flickered back on, but the moment between us didn't fade. We walked back in silence, the air between us buzzing with everything left unsaid. By the time we reached the porch, I wasn't sure if I was more relieved or disappointed that nothing had happened. But as Dominic opened the door, he stopped and turned back to me. "Get some rest," he said, his voice low and almost tender. "Tomorrow's a new day." I nodded, stepping inside, but my mind was far from rest. Something had shifted, and I knew it was only a matter of time before the line between us blurred further. The rain started in the early hours of the morning, soft at first, then building to a steady rhythm that drummed against the roof of the cabin. I couldn't sleep. My thoughts were tangled in the events of the past 2 days. Dominic's words, his glances, the way his presence made me feel both seen and unsteady. By the time the sun had barely begun to rise, I found myself in the kitchen, staring out at the forest shrouded in mist. I didn't hear Dominic come in until his voice broke the silence. "You're up early." I turned to find him leaning against the doorway, his hair slightly tousled and his t-shirt clinging to his frame. There was something softer about him in that moment, stripped of his usual composure. "Couldn't sleep," I admitted. "Too much on my mind." He stepped closer, his bare feet padding softly against the wooden floor. "Want to talk about it?" I hesitated, my gaze dropping to the mug of coffee in my hands. "It's complicated. Most things worth feeling are," he said, his voice low and steady. When I looked up, he was standing right in front of me, close enough that I could see the faint stubble on his jaw, the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. The air between us felt electric, and for a moment, I thought he might step back, break whatever spell had been cast over the room. But he didn't. Instead, Dominic reached out, his hand brushing mine. It was the smallest gesture, but it carried the weight of everything unsaid between us. "Matteo," he said, my name like a question, a warning, and an invitation all at once. "I don't know what I'm doing," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the rain. He smiled, a soft, almost bittersweet curve of his lips. "Neither do I." And then he kissed me. It wasn't rushed or frantic. It was slow, deliberate, like he wanted to give me the chance to pull away but hoped I wouldn't. His lips were warm and firm, and when I didn't resist, he deepened the kiss, his hand sliding to the back of my neck. Every doubt, every hesitation, every reason why this shouldn't happen melted away in that moment. All I could think about was him. How he smelled like cedar and rain, how his touch made my skin tingle, how this felt like something I didn't even know I'd been searching for. When we finally broke apart, our foreheads rested against each other, and I could feel his breath, uneven like mine. "This changes everything," I said, my voice shaking slightly. Dominic nodded, his eyes searching mine. "It does, but that doesn't mean it was wrong." The rest of the day passed in a haze. We didn't talk much, but the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was heavy with the understanding that we'd crossed a line, one we couldn't uncross, but neither of us seemed ready to address what came next. By evening, the rain had stopped and the sun was setting in a blaze of orange and pink. We sat on the porch, watching the light fade and the stars begin to appear. "Do you regret it?" I asked, breaking the silence. Dominic was quiet for a long moment before answering. "No, but I do feel the weight of it." I nodded, understanding what he meant. The weight wasn't just about him and me. It was about my dad, about the trust between them, about the world waiting for us outside the safety of the cabin. "So what now?" I asked, my voice small. Dominic exhaled deeply, running a hand through his hair. "Now, we move forward, carefully, thoughtfully, whatever that looks like for us." His words were careful, but his tone was sincere. He wasn't making promises he couldn't keep, but he also wasn't pretending this didn't mean something. When it was time to leave the cabin the next morning, the ride back was quieter than the drive up. Dominic's hand rested on the gear shift, close enough to mine that I could feel the warmth radiating from his skin, but he didn't reach out. Neither did I. As we pulled into my driveway, he glanced at me, his expression unreadable. "Take care of yourself, Matteo," he said. "You too," I replied, my voice softer than I intended. I stepped out of the car, my bag slung over my shoulder, and watched as Dominic drove away. The house felt different when I walked inside, smaller, louder, like the weight of reality had settled back in. But something inside me had changed. I wasn't sure what the future held for me and Dominic, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was starting to figure out who I was. And that, more than anything, gave me hope.